Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Barnes & Noble. Tonight we welcome the friends of the late J. Anthony Lucas in a celebration of the final work of a phenomenal writer. In the course of his career, J. Anthony Lucas received tremendous accolades, more than most writers ever hoped to win. He twice won the Pulitzer Prize, first for his New York Times reporting, then for his best-selling book on urban desegregation, Common Ground. Common Ground is a tour de force. It evolved from his decades of work in journalism and from his notable previous books, which include The Barnyard Epithet and Other Obscenities, Don't Shoot, We're Your Children, and Nightmare, The Underside of the Nixon Years. It won Mr. Lucas the National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the Robert Kennedy Book Award. But in the course of his writing career, Mr. Lucas also received other accolades, different but no less profound. The honest regard, affection, and loyalty of his colleagues. With his passing, Mr. Lucas left behind a new book, Big Trouble, an amazing examination of the people and politics of an era long gone, and a struggle often forgotten, the violent struggle for political control of our northern states at the turn of the century. That the book has been well received by readers and reviewers is very good, but not enough for those who cared for Mr. Lucas, the remarkably generous colleague in an often ungenerous profession. It's not enough for those who admired his meticulous work or who drew inspiration from his eloquence. It's not enough for those who simply loved being J. Anthony Lucas's friend. So tonight we welcome journalist, author, and friend Nicholas Lemon, whose book The Promised Land Mr. Lucas praised so warmly. We welcome critic and friend Jonathan Yardley, whose book Misfit speaks to the precariousness of a writer's life, and the historian and friend Alan Brinkley, the author of The End of Reform, who so admired the way in which Mr. Lucas embraced his projects. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome these colleagues, admirers, and friends of J. Anthony Lucas, and a salute to the man and his last work, Big Trouble.
I'm Jonathan Yardley. This must now be, if one includes newspaper and radio and television interviews, the 9th or 10th time that I have spoken on behalf of this spectacularly wonderful book, Big Trouble. It's the first time I've done it with the help of people who know more than I do, and I'm extremely grateful to have them here to speak about aspects of the book that they are more informed about than I. I just wanted to speak to you for a minute about what it was like to be Tony's friend. We met 29 years ago at Harvard, where we were both on Nieman Fellowships, which are given annually to a small group of American journalists. We hit it off right away. We were somewhat different in age, very different in background. Tony was and experience and some interests. Tony was, I think, the great reporter of my generation. I was and am an opinion writer, someone who sits in a corner and sucks his thumb. But we found we had a great many interests and characteristics in common, a love of talk, a love of the business of journalism, a love of the gossip of journalism, a love of baseball. And we became friends and remained that way for 30 years with only one rather extended interregnum which was caused when I made the serious mistake of reviewing one of Tony's early books in the New Republic and expressing a minor dissent from one of the conclusions that Tony had drawn, and Tony thought it was necessary not to speak to me for a while about that. But one of the happiest days of my life was in the spring, as I recall it, of 1979. I was up here in New York, had come up from Baltimore to attend a National Book Award ceremony, and was walking up the steps of Carnegie Hall, and there was Tony with this exceptionally attractive young woman who's not all that long thereafter became his wife. And Tony and I looked at each other with sort of astonishment. We had not expected to see each other, and as I recall, Tony said, "John, let's bury the hatchet." And I thought to myself, well, Tony, you're the one who pulled it out of the ground in the first place, so it seems to me it's your decision. But I was so happy to have that wonderful friendship renewed. In the intervening decade and a half, Tony and Linda and my wife Sue and I visited each other regularly in Baltimore and Sag Harbor, and had a friendship that involving all four of us, that's one of the most important things in my life. Tony was endless fun to be with, perhaps the greatest conversationalist I've ever known. His enthusiasms were boundless and infectious. His first important journalistic job was in Baltimore, so coming to see us reconnected Tony with his past, and we would go to eat hard-shell crabs, which he would bang away with mallets with gusto, humming and singing the praises of the crabs. We would go out to Memorial Stadium and then, somewhat less satisfactorily, Camden Yards to see the Orioles, where Tony would be reconnected with the baseball enthusiasms of his youth. And occasionally we would have friends, some of them dating back to Tony's repertorial youthful days at the Baltimore Sun, who would come over for dinner. It's very hard for me to realize that those days are over, but the memories are among the most precious I have. And I have found that talking to people about Big Trouble, a book that I admire without reservation, a book that seems to me to contain within its covers, more about this country than any book since John Dos Passos, USA. Talking about this book brings Tony back into my life, keeps him alive for me, and reminds me of what an incalculable contribution he made to all of us. Nick Lemon.
Thanks, John. I've done a lot of these too, but actually there's one anecdote that I have never gotten around to telling, so I'll start by telling that, which is the story of how I first met Tony. One day somewhere in the early to mid 70s, Tony walked into the office of the Harvard Crimson, and he kind of stalked around and buttonholed me and said, you know, how would you like to make $20? So I said, sure. And he hired me as a research assistant on his book on Watergate called Nightmare. My assignment was, there is a man named William Beecher who during the Watergate era broke an important story about the secret bombing of the Nixon administration, and therefore was wiretapped and plumbered and so on by the Nixon White House. Tony happened to know that Bill Beecher had gone to Harvard because they had been there at about the same time, and so my assignment was to find out who all of Bill Beecher's Harvard roommates were. And I said, well, Mr. Lucas, why do you want to know that? He said, well, don't you see? He said, if we're going to find out who all his roommates were, and I bet that one of them wound up in the foreign policy establishment and leaked to him the story of the bombing, and that way we'll find out, you know, how he knew. So I said, now, so you're saying that Nixon and the full might of the federal government, the plumbers, the FBI, the CIA, couldn't figure out how Bill Beecher got this story, but we're going to figure it out by you're paying me $20 to go through old dorm records at Harvard. And he said, right. It turned out to be a bit of a blind alley, but it's a very Tony story in a couple of ways, as I was later to learn. One is he always wanted to run down every loose end possible as far as it would go. And the other, related, is he always thought he was, by doing so, he was going to get something that nobody else had gotten. In his mind, and you see this very much in this book, everything was connected to everything else sooner or later. And by just sheer repertorial determination, you could make the connections. Almost as if journalists were a sort of privileged priesthood that had the ability to get things hooked up to other things in a way that nobody else in the society would. So that was my introduction to Tony Lucas. Now, as I've been doing some of these events, this is almost like a parlor game you can play about Big Trouble. Wherever you happen to be talking about Big Trouble, you can open the book and find a little passage to read about the place where you are, which I will now do briefly. He's talking about a period when there's going to be a series of labor demonstrations in support of the people accused of murdering Governor Steunenberg. The day's centerpiece was to be New York City's great procession, designed to culminate in a mass rally at Grand Central Palace. The focus on New York seemed natural enough, for socialists had a greater presence in the nation's largest city than anywhere else in the land. Over the last decades of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th, New York had been a powerful magnet to Jewish immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe, carrying with them a revolutionary cast of mind grounded in a synthesis of Talmudic and socialist doctrine. Jewish immigration to New York took place in stages, depositing settlers like mineral layers on a mountainside. The first Jews to arrive were Sephardim from Spain, Portugal, and Holland, reaching the New World in the 17th and 18th centuries, gradually dispersing to some of the city's most comfortable neighborhoods. Next came German Jews, who reached these shores in the mid-19th century. Most German Jews tended to remain within New York's German community, for years centered on Dutchtown, just north of Houston Street, until the more socially mobile settled uptown in Yorkville. Beginning about 1870, the German impulse to emigrate spread from the Silesian plains into Poland. All through the 70s, Polish Jews, many of them skilled tailors from Suwałki province, streamed into lower Manhattan, settling first around Bayard and Mott Streets, later at the foot of Canal Street, where it converged with Essex Street and East Broadway to form Rutgers Square. They were followed by Hungarians, Romanians, and Galicians, each group finding its niche in this polyglot neighborhood. But their combined influx was nothing compared to the staggering migration about to begin of Russian Jews. A wave of anti-Jewish pogroms beginning in Elizabethgrad in April 1881 triggered a Jewish immigration from Russia that mounted steadily over the next 2 decades. A terrible massacre on Easter Sunday, 1903, in the Bessarabian capital of Kishinev, costing the lives of 50 Jews, set off a new wave of emigration, soon swelling into a panicky flight. By 1904, annual Russian Jewish migration to the United States reached 77,544. In 1906, it peaked at 125,832, many immigrants settling within a peddler's shout of Rutgers Square. By then, the Lower East Side was dressed out in a coat of many colors, as richly variegated as the Eastern European society it replicated. To the Russian intelligentsia, East Broadway was New York's Nevsky Prospect, the grand boulevard of Imperial St. Petersburg. It was there that physicians and dentists practiced in spacious brownstones, shaded by leafy trees. A few blocks north, Grand Street was the community's principal shopping thoroughfare, where great department stores like Lord & Taylor and Lichtenstein's got their start. At cafes along Canal and Houston Streets, the immigrants sat for hours sipping tea from tall glasses and talking of Kropotkin and the Yiddish theater. I'll stop there. It goes on, by the way. More vivid description, a whole kind of riff that's wonderful on the Jewish Daily Forward, and all this by way of introducing a demonstration thousands of miles away from the principal characters in the book. This passage is really typical of Tony and typical of Big Trouble. Typical of Tony in the incredible amount of research. Anyone who is a writer knows how easy it would have been to gloss over what I just read in a sentence or half a sentence. Instead, Tony has just chased down, read, visited, found fact after fact after fact. It's laid out cleanly, very informatively, and always with the little flourish of writing. Never flashy, but the flourish is always there. There's always the artistry. It's not, it starts looking like it's a recitation, and then it takes flight. It's typical of the book because, as John said, he clearly wanted to get under one roof or in one jacket all of America at the start of the 20th century, and this is one of the ways he did it, was by jumping from place to place to place to place. To give you an analogy that Tony would not have been comfortable with, it's a little bit like hypertext links on the World Wide Web, where he just flies between subject, discussing each one seemingly effortlessly. One reason why Tony meant so much to other journalists is we know what all the temptations are. There's the temptation to underreport. There's the temptation not to follow threads. There's the temptation to go with the kind of the hot celebrity topic instead of what's really important and what you started your career wanting to write about. And finally, as you get older, there's the temptation to kind of sit behind your desk and put up your feet and write genial reflections on your life. Tony never yielded in the slightest way to any of these temptations. He's the only person I can think of in journalism of whom that can be said. At every step of his life, as he would refuse to make the compromises that everyone else makes, he would grow in the esteem of his colleagues. So I'm pleased to be able to stand here and talk about him and his work. Thanks. Alan?
Well, as John and Nick have suggested, Tony was an extraordinary reporter through much of his adult life, an extraordinary writer, and by the end of his life he had become as well an extraordinary historian. And Big Trouble is first and foremost a work of history. One of the occupational hazards of doing historical research is the necessity, very often depending on your subject, of spending a great deal of time in places that you just as soon not be. I once spent a week in Laramie, Wyoming doing research, perfectly nice town, but it felt like a month to me. Tony spent months and months and months in small towns in the American West and small cities, Boise, Caldwell, and elsewhere. And I never heard him complain. I never heard him say anything about it but express the excitement that he felt in the material he was uncovering. Tony had an unbelievable appetite for a kind of research that most historians would never have the patience to do. He had research assistants in Idaho. He had research assistants in New York, one of whom, Adam Rothman, is here tonight. But most of what was most important to him, he felt that he had to do himself. But it wasn't just this enormous capacity for research that I think made Tony become such an important historian. It was also an enormous appetite for history and even for historical scholarship, something that people outside the academy often balk at having to read. Tony read enormously widely in the history of the United States at the turn of the century, in labor history, in Western history. When the New York Times ran the story describing the group of friends who were performing in these contexts during this book tour, I suppose we can call it, and when I wrote a review, perhaps somewhat inappropriately, of the book in the New Republic, I began to get calls and emails from historians that I know all over the United States, and one after another, I would say, "Oh, I was so glad to hear what you're doing for Tony Lucas because he came to see me." And we had a long conversation about this aspect or that aspect of the book. And Tony had traveled the United States not just looking for archives, but looking for historians to talk to and looking for suggestions on what to read. And one after another, my colleagues in the historical profession talked to me about how much they had admired him, how much they admired not only the work they had read, but the kind of work that he was doing in Big Trouble. Big Trouble is, as Nick and John have said, a panoramic history of American life at the turn of the century, but at its core, it's the history of a trial. The trial of three men, directors of the Western Federation of Miners, a very militant Western Union, who were accused of complicity in the murder of a former governor of Idaho, Frank Steunenberg, who was killed by a bomb that was planted in his front yard and exploded when he opened his front gate. The trial, however, is in large part a vehicle through which this book explores the character of class relations and labor relations in the turn of the century America. And in doing so, it is, on the one hand, a confirmation of much of what American labor history has tried to do over the last generation or so, which is to restore to our historical memory the reality of the very intense and continuing class conflict that has been a part of our history almost from the beginning, and it was a particularly intensive part of our history in these early years of American large-scale industrial capitalism. It's also an effort to restore to our consciousness the reality of class in American life, a continuing reality in our own time, but one that we don't talk about very often, and that historians have at various points in our scholarly past made little of. What Tony did in this book, it seems to me, was to take the concepts that labor historians and other historians have developed over a generation or so and bring them into a kind of life that very few historians would ever be able to do. To portray a trial and the events surrounding a trial with a kind of vividness and color and depth of detail that it's almost impossible to imagine anyone else doing. And in the process, I think, he makes us aware that some of the issues that are important in our own time, issues of inequality, issues of class, issues of the distribution of wealth and power, issues that we are all aware of but don't really have a language to talk about, have a history in the 20th century and well before it, and that there have been times in our history in which these issues were at the center of American political and cultural and social life, and in which they mesmerized a nation, as they did in the course of this enormously celebrated and dramatic trial of Charles Moyer and George Pettibone and Big Bill Haywood, one of the most celebrated figures in American labor history. So this is an extraordinary narrative, an extraordinary series of stories, an extraordinary portrait of American life, but it's also an extraordinarily important contribution to a historical endeavor that it now spans several generations to recover a part of our past that in the self-congratulatory years of the middle 20th century we tended to forget. And so I think we have an enormous debt of gratitude to pay to Tony, not just for writing a book that is such a pleasure to read and so informative, but also one that's so important in bringing out beyond the academy a series of historical perceptions that are still unfamiliar to many Americans, but that are absolutely central to the reality of American history. Thank you.
At this time, we invite you to put forth any questions that you may have for our guests. I guess I'll ask the first question. Mr. Lucas had described writing as healing, a healing process for the damaged. And I wondered about this tour for you and for the others who are participating in it. Could you talk about the healing of coming to the aid of a friend?
Tony's death was the hardest thing that's ever happened to me. The deaths of my parents came after long illnesses and were merciful. Tony's death came from out of the blue and took away someone whose place in my life I hadn't fully understood until it wasn't there anymore. This isn't therapy, but it helps. It helps mainly, I think, because to me, Tony, being Tony's friend was something that I was so proud of that it's almost impossible to put into words. Tony was someone that I admired without reservation, as a writer and as a journalist and, as Alan says, as a historian. To be Tony's friend seemed to me a mark of enormous distinction and honor to carry into life. And it's very hard to lose something like that in one's life. What these appearances on behalf of this book do for me is to give me some feeling that we are helping, all of us who are doing this, are helping bringing this enormously important work to the attention of readers who are going to grow as a consequence of it. You know, books, these gentlemen can tell you better than anybody else in this room, books have lives that transcend the lives of the people who write them. I've published 5 books, all of which sink like rocks. And but still, almost a decade after a book that I wrote about my mother and father, once a month I get a letter or an email or something from someone who has read that book, to whom it means something, or who hates it. And that is a way that you keep on living through the books that you write. Tony keeps living through this book, and helping get the message of this book out to more people is very important to me. Thanks.
You mentioned Mr. Lucas's tremendous capacity for research, but a book like Common Ground, most of the principals are alive, and a book like Big Trouble, I guess they're all deceased. It seems that almost requires 2 different skill sets to get a book done. Could you comment on that? Is that so?
Well, that is true to a point. It is no longer the case, I think, that the techniques of journalists and the techniques of historians are entirely separate. Historians make enormous use of oral history when they can, and journalists, good ones, like Tony, make use of archival material when they can. And he had done archival work for Common Ground, as well as doing interviews. But obviously Big Trouble was a very different kind of project for him than anything he had done before. Everything else he had ever written had been more or less contemporary, or at least in a near enough past that most of the people he was writing about were still alive. Big Trouble, of course, takes place at the beginning of the 20th century, and none of the figures in this book is still alive, and everything had to come from manuscripts and archives and newspapers and magazines and previous histories. And of course, most of human history is before anybody living can remember. And so he was doing what most historians do in all their work. And that he did it with such zest and with such skill after a lifetime as essentially a reporter, thinking in repertorial terms about how to find sources among the living, seems to me a real tribute to his capacity as a writer and intellectual, and I think a scholar.
How did he decide on this project? Or why?
Do you may know more about that than me, or do we all know the same? The best, I mean, you all break in. The best I can do is, I also want to say something about the previous question, but the best I can do on this is it's a little like, you know, falling in love with someone you didn't think you were going to fall in love with. I think it's sort of, this subject took him, and he was surprised that it took him. He, after Common Ground, he went through a period of looking around at various book ideas. There was one idea that he walked down the road quite a considerable way on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I always got the impression that he was sort of stunned by the power with which this trial, which has, you know, before he wrote the book, had faded into complete obscurity, grabbed his imagination. It's one of the things that happens to writers. Does that seem fair to you all?
The period after the publication of Common Ground was at once totally exhilarating for Tony and very, very difficult. Common Ground is one of the great American books. I hate list making, but tomorrow night in Baltimore I'm giving a talk at Johns Hopkins, and I've been asked to give a list of 10 books that people have to read, and Common Ground is on there, and it's not because Tony was my friend. It's because it's a great, great book. The reception that Common Ground received was at once everything that a writer can pray for and a terrible obstacle to overcome. Tony was a very proud man. Tony had standards for himself that nobody except Tony Lucas could reach. And Tony was not going to follow Common Ground with a book that did not reach the standards that Common Ground had. Try to imagine that. Try to imagine following 100 Years of Solitude. The process by which Tony came to Big Trouble was very long and very, very painful. Tony talked for hours and hours and hours with me and to all of his friends. What he could do. Nick mentions the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was also a long consideration of finding a legal case involving malpractice that would pose the legal profession against the medical profession and thus place into conflict two of America's most respected professions. It is my understanding that Tony came across a paragraph or two about the Frank Steunenberg, Big Bill Haywood case, I believe in one of Frank Sullivan's histories of 20th century America, and that there was just something about it that jumped out at him. It took him a long, long time to become engaged with the book. And in the first couple of years of research on it, I remember many times his saying, "John, I just don't know. I just don't know if I want to keep on with this. I just don't feel as though it's the right thing for me." And then, I think this was about 4 years ago, he would be in Baltimore, or we would be in Sag Harbor, and he would start talking about Steunenberger. And then he and Linda got a Norfolk Terrier. My wife and I also have a Norfolk Terrier, and they named him Steunenberger. And I realized this book was beginning to take control of Tony, and that he was beginning to engage with it in the same way that he had with Common Ground. And I realized then that for every time I saw Tony, I was going to be hearing about what became Big Trouble. And I prepared myself for lots of talk about Idaho at the turn of the century, and I was very, very glad.
Let me just add this other small point on the question you asked about the skill set. Tony was, and this to me is really tragic, the relationship, there's a certain kind of journalistic work when you're doing a book where you get very, 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 very close to a person that you're writing a book about, or a series of people. And it's this highly charged emotional relationship. I think on Common Ground, Tony felt completely wrongly that he felt sort of spooked by his relationship with the characters in Common Ground, who, as if those of you who were at his memorial service know, were deeply touched by him and loved him. Inevitably, there's a little friction there. Tony was a very, very sensitive man, and the small amount of friction that went on with the characters in Common Ground, I think, affected him and hurt him deeply. I think he was also outraged and kind of hurt by a book that didn't mention him at all, and that's Janet Malcolm's book, The Journalist and the Murderer, which begins and goes on from a kind of very facile, witty observation about journalists doing wrong to the people they write about. That's the kind of thing that Tony would never do, but just to know that the accusation was kind of out there floating around tormented him. And I think that he wanted to do a project where all those uncomfortable issues would not come into play, and that's part of why he chose this, knowing that he wouldn't be writing about living people.
We're going to take our final question.
Maybe it's me, but all three of you speak of him with almost a reverence. and an obvious affection and respect. Yet I can't get a handle on what made him unique. What lifted him above others who do or have done his kind of work? What was the quality or the philosophy or the compassion that he had that bonded you to him? I'd be interested in hearing all of you.
Well, that's a very, I mean, the question was basically what made Tony such an important figure to so many people. And it's a very difficult question to answer. And it's a particularly difficult question to answer under these circumstances. I mean, losing a friend in this way is a particularly hard thing to come to terms with, which is part of the reason we're all here. I knew Tony perhaps not as long as John or Nick, but for quite a long time. And one of the things that bonded me to him was just the sheer pleasure and excitement of being in his presence. I mean, he was filled with such energy and passion and enthusiasm for what he was doing, and even in moments of despair, and there of course were moments of despair in the writing of this book, even his despair was something that you know, embraced the people he talked to, and had an intelligence and a logic. It was hard to find an uninteresting moment in Tony's presence. I greatly admired his work and had admired it even before I met him. I, like John and Nick, I think Common Ground is a truly great book. But that was only part of what made Tony such an important person to so many people. It was also his enormous capacity to share his own thoughts, to listen to other people's thoughts. He was a kind of, in a way, a larger than life figure in our lives. For me, at least, that's probably why I'm here.
Let me try it at a slightly different way. There's I was thinking about this as I was listening to Alan. Tony, you have a kind of original conception of yourself, right? When you're starting and when you're a kid in college or something, and you're a sophomore in college and you're staying up until 3 in the morning every night with your friends, and you're passionate and you're romantic and you're talking about all the things you're going to do in your life, and you're going to follow your interests absolutely, and you're going to never compromise. And you're going to continue to grow and push, and you're going to fight injustice, and you're never going to take the edge off your beliefs. And that's a sort of common framework for people. There's a kind of journalistic version of it where you are obsessed about the high practice of journalism and outraged at people who depart from it. You will never do that. Well, okay, we all start that way. The amazing thing about Tony is he stayed that way. In fact, he got more that way. Every time you thought he couldn't get any more that way, he just got more that way, and this book proves it. And, as you think over the course of a life, you think a lot of people start at that level of passion and commitment and just total idealistic engagement with whatever they do in life. And you see them one by one drop off and fall off, and I have this image of kind of one man left standing at that level, and that's Tony, and that's what makes him so remarkable.
Yeah, Nick is absolutely right. Two things that I would like to remark on, I guess, to close this off. One is Tony's endless, infinite curiosity. He wanted to know everything. The reason that Tony kept chasing down all those rabbit holes is he wanted to know what was at the bottom. As both Nick and Alan have said, it's so easy. I know this. I've done it. To take a look at something and say, hey, it's not worth going down that rabbit hole. Tony always went down. He could not resist it, and he found things down there. Only Tony, I swear to God, on the face of the earth, could have found out the actual identity of the Pinkerton agent identified only by number in all of the records of this case. Tony found out who that bastard was. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. The other thing that I want to say about Tony, this came home to me with just almost unbearable force at the memorial service when Rachel and Cassandra Twyman, the daughters of the black Boston family that figures so prominently and centrally in Common Ground, when they talked about the reverence they had for Tony and about the interest that he maintained in their lives long after this book was done and gone, long after he was in something else, he continued to care about them. Now, I know, because I see a few familiar faces, there's some people in this room who knew Tony. Those of you who didn't know him may not have known that Tony was a rather forbidding man. He was tall and carried himself in a lordly way and could seem, he had a wicked glare if he cared to put it on, and he could seem dismissive. He could seem to be a member of that journalistic elite that is focused in the New York Times and the other great journalistic and publishing institutions of this city. And yet Tony was always open to people who were ordinary. He always cared about them. I've heard from a great many people, by mail, by telephone, by email, since Tony's death, people I've never heard of. Oh, I met Tony at so-and-so. He was really interested in me. The first thing that I did for this book in a public way was at a bookstore just outside of Baltimore. And I talked and talked and talked. And at the end, after people had asked questions, a man came up to me. He was blind with one of those canes. And he told me that he had taken 2 buses and some other form of transportation to come to this, because when he was young, Tony Lucas had encouraged him in his interest in journalism. He had gone to conventions of More magazine, of which Tony was one of the founding editors. He had known that Tony, this famous journalist with 1 Pulitzer in his pocket and another on the way, Tony cared about him. Tony cared about all those people in Common Ground, and it was hard for him to make that leap from people he interviewed in person to those he found in the dusty old pages in Boise, Idaho. But he came to care about them too. They weren't a very attractive bunch, but you're going to find, if you haven't read Big Trouble yet, that you care about them because Tony cared about them and made you feel the same way. He was an amazing man.
Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for joining us and sharing what you know from a scholarly perspective of the greatness of this book and what you know from a personal perspective of the greatness of the man who wrote it. I thank you.